who I originally contacted, emailed me in the spring and let me know that he couldn't make it. Something came up, but he said, I rest assure you, you don't have to worry about finding anybody else because I got my replacement ready. So this man was kind enough to fill in for him and travel from the DC area today. His name is Dr. Can I use Jim? Yeah. James Green. He's a NASA chief scientist. He has received his PhD in physics from the University of Iowa. He has worked for NASA for over 35 years, managing and participating in a number of NASA solar system missions. Although his day job involves NASA, he had a long, passionate personal interest in the history of the Civil War and particularly ballooning. For more than 25 years, James has conducted research into the Civil War balloons and has spoken at a number of events, including the 150th anniversary of Lowe's first teetered balloon ascension on the Washington, D.C. wall, from which the first aerial telegraph was sent. He served as an advisor in the Intrepid project, an initiative to construct and fly the world's first replica of a Civil War balloon named manned balloon at Genesee County Village and Museum in Mumford, New York. He has worked with Civil War Trust by identifying locations of the balloon stations during the Peninsula Campaign. So I would like us here at Hershey Civil War Roundtable to give Jim a nice warm welcome.
So the Balloon Corps, as we commonly have called it, isn't really well known, but I hope to change that over the course of the evening. But as you probably recognize, taking the high ground is always one of the most important things you can do because you can gather military intelligence. And this is really all about troop, strength, location, and movement. That's the intelligence you want to be able to extract. And the balloons were able to do that all over the place. So let's get started. The beginning of the Civil War, after Fort Sumter was attacked on April 12, 1861, call for war was ringing out throughout all the newspapers. Many of the aeronauts were encouraged. In fact, you can read many of the old Civil War papers of that era where they're talking about the importance of balloons to gather that kind of intelligence. And so aeronauts came out of the woodwork to be able to start working with the Army. And I'm going to talk about a few failed attempts. One of the first ones was James Allen. He is a hardcore balloonist all his life. He actually died in the 1890s in a balloon accident in Providence, Rhode Island. He joined the 1st Regiment, Rhode Island, that Burnside was putting together. And so he went down to Washington, D.C. They camped at Captain's Farm, which is on the corner of New York and Rhode Island, if you're familiar with the D.C. area. Of course, it doesn't look like that now. And you can just barely make out the Capitol building in the background. From that location, Allen was able to fill his balloon at the local gas works. So, unlike today, when you walk in a room and turn on a light, during that period of time, you would, in these major cities, go into your building, turn on a spigot, which would have illumination gas that's being fed to you, and you lit that. That illumination gas is carbonated hydrogen. It comes from slow burning peat and unmatured coal, and that was done in many of these cities. That gas then was put in large tanks and then shoved through the pipes, and illumination gas then was readily available. In DC, the place where the illumination gas is located is currently the position of the American Indian Museum, right across the street from the Air and Space Museum. That's where the illumination gas place was. So Allen would fill his balloon there, and then try to work with Burnside's First Rhode Island. But he had all kinds of problems. When they would go into Virginia, he would fill it up at the gas works at Alexandria, and after several attempts, he realized he just didn't have the equipment and capability to be able to pull it off. He popped one of these balloons. These are fragile balloons. Balloons are meant to ride the air and to be light, and they weren't designed to be tethered and held in place, blasted by the wind. And so consequently, he recognized early on that that wasn't going to be working for him. Another one, John LeMountain, also a very famous aeronaut at the time. And I'm sorry I can't see the map, but Washington, D.C., and here's Richmond, and right here's the end of the Potomac and Fortress Monroe, down at the bottom of what's called the Peninsula, is where Ben Butler was. General Butler actually held Fortress Monroe, while many other places all around were being captured by the Confederates and taken over. Fortress Monroe was solidly in Union hands early on in the war. And he actually hired John LeMountain to come down with one of his balloons, which John did. It was the Atlantic. John had two balloons, the Atlantic and the Saratoga. The Atlantic was the smaller one. And came down, and actually, in the June, July, and August timeframe, while Butler was the commanding general at Fortress Monroe, actually did some fabulous observations. One of the observations, he actually launched it from a small boat called Fanny, and from the Fanny he was able to make some sketches. So here's our first really great balloon sketch. This is at Sewell's Point, and you see the tents and the gun emplacements were being put in. And this is August 10th, 1861. And so these were important observations because Butler needed to know what kind of activity the Confederates were installing guns and pointing at Fortress Monroe and what they would encounter in the future. So LeMountain did a really great job supporting that until Ben Butler actually got changed by McClellan, who had come in at that time. And Butler went to, I don't remember exactly where he ended up, but the new commander that came in didn't like balloons, didn't use LeMountain, and so LeMountain was very discouraged and ended up coming up into the Washington, D.C. area. And he'll come back in our story again. The really famous aeronaut who just started becoming an aeronaut a few years before the war, and he was really coming up in notoriety, is this guy, Thaddeus Lowe. And Thaddeus Lowe knew Joseph Henry. They corresponded a lot. One of the things Lowe wanted to do, along with several other aeronauts, is actually do a transatlantic flight. And this was going on, this big discussion at aeronautic conferences where the aeronauts would get together and talk about how they could do that, because the winds at altitude actually blow from west to east. The concept is, well, we could probably cross the Atlantic faster than any boat could and do it in a matter of days. And bring information, and rapid information can be quite important financially. So, with the outbreak of the war, that stopped that whole idea. Joseph Henry advised Lowe that if he wanted to participate in the war, he needed to come down to Washington, D.C. and get the attention of Abraham Lincoln. And indeed, this is the activity that Lowe decided to do. He brought one of his balloons, the Enterprise, down. This is what the mall looked like in 1861. Here's what it looks like, of course, today. Here's the gas works, and the canal, the C&O Canal, ran through the mall like this. Right? And so Lowe stayed at one of the local hotels, brought his balloon over, gassed it up, and in this area right here, right in front of the Air and Space Museum, he went up to about 500 feet, tethered it. And he tethered his balloon. Wasn't designed, this experiment, to be a free flight, so he wanted it tethered. And with him, he brought a telegraph operator and the telegraph operator supervisor, who absolutely had to go up with him. And so the telegraph operator, using a Grelo telegraph, sat at the bottom of the balloon, and Lowe went up 500 feet. And so that telegraph line then came down and was connected into the local telegraph lines, and we've recreated that event on the 150th anniversary, June 17, 1861. So here is the recreation. We did this on the mall. Here's the actually the Air and Space Museum. Here is the American Indian Museum. This is where the gas works were. So right here, we recreated the activity. Worked really well, and it's commemorated by this particular plaque that we put right on the outside of the building, the Air and Space Museum. Coming to the back way, you can see it. Now, from the balloon, this is the view you have. We actually were allowed, and we applied and got the approval to have a helium-filled balloon, more of a modern balloon with cameras on it, to go up to altitude, 500 feet, and then take images of that area. So this is really pretty much what we're seeing here, of course, is Virginia. Here, of course, is Potomac. The White House actually is right here. It's sitting in the trees. They're on the way. But you can get a feel for what that was like exactly 150 years ago. Now, from the balloon, Lowe recites a telegram, and that telegram is delivered to the President of the United States. So when Henry told Lowe he needed to get the President's attention, this was the obvious thing for him to do. This was the first aerial telegram ever done, okay? In fact, it was thought at that time you couldn't really do that from altitude for a whole variety of bogus reasons. And Lowe knew that wasn't the case. So here's what the telegram said. To the President, from Balloon Enterprise, this point of observation commands an area nearly 50 miles in diameter. The city with its girdle of encampments presents a superb scene. I have the pleasure in sending you this first dispatch ever telegraphed from an aerial station, and in acknowledging indebtedness to the encouragement for the opportunity of demonstrating the availability of the science of aeronautics and military service of the country. So this indeed got Lincoln's attention. That telegram was delivered. Lincoln read it, invited Lowe that night to have dinner with him at the White House. And so indeed Lowe took his balloon, went to the backyard of the White House, had it tethered down, and then spent a significant amount of the evening talking to Lincoln one-on-one about the advantages from a balloon to obtain military intelligence. Okay, that's troop size, location, and movement. All right. Now, this telegram is really perfect, and a perfect example of what Lowe does. Yeah, 50 miles is too far, really, to be able to observe at 500 feet anything. Okay, and so he loves to exaggerate. He can barely see into Virginia, so he's not really going to see much in the way of any of the Confederate Army. He needs to be up higher. Now he knows that, but he really is really all about selling it. In fact, that's an element of what Lowe did. Is he is a superb salesman, in addition to a superb engineer, although he always called himself a scientist, which he wasn't. Take my word for it. Now, once Lincoln really got to know Lowe and recognized the importance of military intelligence from aloft, Lowe eventually becomes the head of what was called at the time the Aeronautics Department, AD. All right? And that was under McClellan. McClellan loved the idea, and so anything Lowe wanted, he got. And Lowe wanted to build a fleet of balloons. This is the first balloon he built. It's called the Union, 38 feet wide, 45 feet high, 32,000 cubic feet of gas capacity. With 4 cables, you could lift 5 men and cost the government $1,500. All right. Now, Lowe, in building these balloons, had a certain approach. The first approach is that, as you can see, this is beautifully illustrated. Okay, painted so that you could easily see it. And one of the things Lowe wanted to make absolutely sure happen is through intimidation. When he sent a balloon up, he wanted everyone to see it. And it wasn't going to be painted gray or bluish gray or try to hide in the clouds or any of that stuff. He wanted everybody to see it because the idea was the Confederates would look at the balloon, I can see the balloon, therefore they can see me. Well, that's a fallacy. It's not going to happen that way. But that was an element of what Lowe did. All right. So Lowe had these beautifully painted balloons. He built them very special with imported silk that was double silk, sewn in a particular way, and coated with a varnish that was airtight. You would fill these balloons with illumination gas. These were not hot air balloons. You'd fill them with carbonated hydrogen. And then Lowe later on also developed the capability of filling them with molecular hydrogen. He was really good at chemistry. And so this is the kind of thing he did. He also recognized that as tethered balloons, they'd have to withstand the wind. So he built them strong. He built them large because he wanted them to be able to take up as many officers and others as possible and be up for long periods of time. Now, each of these balloons, once filled, could stay aloft for long periods of time and didn't need to be inflated for 3 or 4 weeks. Okay? So an aeronaut could be in the balloon all day and all night. All right? A tethered balloon, looking, and many of them did, and looking out over particular areas. So they were very strong, specially made, and had certain lift capacity. So this is his first one, the Union. Now in that class, the next one is the Intrepid. This is the really famous balloon that you see if you've seen any of the Brady photographs of Lowe on the Peninsula, that area between New York and the James River, where McClellan was going to knock off Richmond. The Intrepid is really in that same Union class, 4 cables, 5 men. Another balloon is the Constitution. All right. Now this is slightly smaller. Of course, that made it a little cheaper. Still 4 cables, 3 men. The number of cables were important. You had to have a minimum of 3 cables. All right. Because if you didn't and you had 1 cable, the wind would spin the balloon. And so you don't create a stable platform. With 4 cables, or 3 at the least, tied off or held by a detail of men, you can be stable and you can observe in particular positions and directions. The United States, also in the class of the previous balloon, the smaller class balloons, the Washington, all right, 2 men. This is a 2-man balloon. These are at different sizes because Lowe wanted to be able to do a couple things. One is get them inflated faster, go up quicker, but that was at the cost of who you could take up. So this is a 2-man balloon. Then he built 2 smaller balloons, the ones that can inflate in 20 minutes or less. The large balloons took several hours. Okay, and so here is the Excelsior, and the Eagle. And these are one-man balloons with significantly less gas. All right. So there's the 7 balloons that he had, and he hired a whole series of aeronauts. All right. So Lowe hired Ebenezer Sieber, James Allen, John Steiner, Joseph Starkweather, and he was handed John LeMountain. Now LeMountain and Lowe did not get along at all. They fought constantly. And so since LeMountain had 2 of his own balloons, the Saratoga and the Atlantic, Lowe refused giving him any balloons, and really wanted to shun LeMountain. And so that kind of rivalry did not help the reputation of the balloon corps. Now Lowe also invented gas generators. Okay, so these generators, these wooden generators that fit nicely on wagon wheels, Conestoga-like system. He built 12 of those initially, but since he lost 2, and I'll tell you how that happened, he had 2 more built. Okay, they went with these balloons. So the smaller balloons would require 1 of the gas generators, and the larger balloons, you would use 2 gas generators to fill a balloon. Now, how they worked is you would fill inside these boxes that were designed to be well-constructed tanks, if you will, iron filings, and then from the top, from this top right here, you pour in a dilute solution of sulfuric acid. So that's H2SO4 plus Fe, and that's an exothermic reaction. And you pop off the oxygen and the hydrogen. You disassociate them because the iron gets oxidized, takes that oxygen out of the water, and you end up then with H2 molecular hydrogen that you then go from the tanks. It pours out of these tanks because the pressure builds up, goes through these scrubbers where they actually take out impurities, and then goes through another one which actually cools this very hot molecular hydrogen. So that meant that these portable gas generators, whenever he would take them into the field, is he needed water, and a lot of it. So he would always be near rapidly flowing streams. So as they went out into the field, that's where he'd be looking for. He'd be looking for a place that was typically depressed, because he wanted to be able to hide the balloon from the Confederates until he was ready to loft it and then surprise them as he goes out. So here he is. This is one of the famous Brady photographs. This is the 4th Maine. Lowe, every time he'd go and have his aeronauts take some of these balloons to different locations, he would not have a crew. He had a few military men assigned to him, but only a handful that did a lot of paperwork, etc., and would work with the Army to acquire salary and pay these guys. These were all contractors. All right, so Lowe and his team were never in the military. They were hired on. Okay, and so when he would go, he would need 35 or 30 to 35 men, and they were always detailed to him. And so the 4th Maine was detailed to him, and there's more than 350 or so men that had been detailed over a long period of time, 2 to 3 years in the Balloon Corps, 61, 62, and 63, before it was disbanded, supporting these balloons. And that included the 118th Pennsylvania. Okay, so there's 35 men from the 118th Pennsylvania that helped support Lowe on the peninsula. This is a rapidly flowing stream. This is the Gaines Mill House right here. We're down in a valley, and here's Lowe himself, and here's the man filling that particular balloon, which turns out to be the Intrepid. Now he would use these men on three of the ropes. So typically, when he went into battle or needed to come up right away with the balloon and move it, he would have 10 men on a line. and they would train these men on how to deploy the balloon. He would go up and they would move that into position. So from the Gainesville farm, as you can see, they were in this big ravine. They would inflate the balloon, the men would get to their lines, and they would walk up the hill. And so he'd have the advantage of a hill, and then he would go up 1,000 feet, all right? So he knew he needed to get up at altitude. Now, at 1,000 feet, you can see 15 miles, okay? That is what it takes an army to move in a day. Now, one of the things that Lincoln really liked about that whole concept is, of course, Maryland fortunately stayed in the Union, but there was a lot of Confederate sympathies. Virginia, a lot of talk in the paper that they could just cross the Potomac and knock off Washington, D.C. And so Lincoln wanted the ability to have intelligence coming in that monitored the armies on the other side of the Potomac and kept Washington, D.C. safe. And Lowe provided that. Did that actually very well. So that's how Lowe worked. Many of these cases, but not all, he would take a telegraph system with him. And that telegraph system would be connected into, whether it's McClellan or other groups. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. When Lowe's base was in Philadelphia, all right? His base was in Philadelphia, where he was stationed. And he had his seamstress there making the balloons. And so on the train ride from Washington, D.C. up to Philadelphia, he made this sketch. Okay, this is an original Lowe sketch. And the idea is, wow, I need a conveyance that can be towed. And this would give you the opportunity then for a mobile platform that extends well beyond what these 30 men can take them and be able to do get into places with the balloon that you couldn't do on land. And so this sketch he took back to McClellan, told McClellan this is what he absolutely had to have. McClellan approved it, went over to the Navy Yard and picked out a vessel. Now the vessel he ended up picking out was the George Washington Parke Custis. Now the George Washington Parke Custis, okay, if you remember, Arlington was in the Lee family. That was a Custis property. Lee's wife was a Custis. And George Washington Parke Custis owned that mansion. And in the 1840s and early 1850s, he had a scooter built to take material to market. And also bring people across the Potomac to his property when he had a variety of events, which he'd do fairly often. So the G.W. Parke Custis was built in Washington, D.C. for that purpose, for the Custis family. And so this boat was sold just prior to the Civil War, and the Army picked it up, eventually picked it up, kept the name, tore off the superstructure because it was had a great hull, and they wanted to use it as a coal barge, okay? So here you are in the Navy Yard, which is in the Anacostia River, and all the big boats, the several masted boats would come up. The Potomac couldn't get into the Anacostia, so they would take these coal barges and take the coal out to the boats. And that's what they had planned to use this vessel for. Lowe saw it after they had stripped off the superstructure and said, great, I want it, plank it, and he made the first aircraft carrier out of it. Now, I have to tell you, my impression, knowing Lowe as intimately as I have, reading his stuff and what he's done and what he claims to have done over the years, he probably got that idea from John Lamont, all right? Because Lamont actually did it from another vessel, and like Lowe, he just wanted to one-up it. We'll make it a flat top boat, where he could actually put his gas generators on it, okay, and build the balloons and then launch them, and then have them towed. So indeed, that worked slick, and this boat did a really wonderful service. So, the beginning of the war, Lowe kept Washington safe. All right, he deployed balloons from Edwards Ferry, Fairfax Courthouse, Cloudsville, Poet Church, on down to Budds Ferry. So that line was designed to observe Confederates over in Virginia to provide an alert if Washington, D.C. was going to be invaded. Okay? So he had stationed many of these aeronauts, as you can see here, all the aeronauts that were stationed. So let's go through several of these locations. One, Edwards Ferry. Now, so Edwards Ferry, once again, that's way up here, way high. Why is it so high up? Well, it turns out what was happening in Washington, D.C. to get intelligence information, which many people living in Washington, D.C. were very sympathetic to the Confederacy and would know generals, or be at variety meetings, and women would be interacting with the generals, etc. And they would gather intelligence on troop strength and what states they were from, all that kind of information. That had to flow. And it turns out one of the best ways to do it was go up here and cross into Virginia at Edwards Ferry. This was a place where information was leaking into Virginia big time. And so McClellan had Stone take a corps up and stop that intelligence. And then Stone decided to test the Confederacy. In October, we went across, and the Battle of Wellspluff was an absolute disaster. Right after that, McClellan said, "You're getting a balloon." And so he sent a balloon up. Here's Edwards Ferry. Okay, this is actually a period sketch, and that balloon with an eagle on it gives it away. This is one of those famous balloons. And this Fort Evans, the really big fort, which is right here, was where a lot of the Confederates stayed. This is their big fort. And so Edwards Ferry then was this particular location, for which we recreated, once again from altitude, using our helium balloon and cameras, the look and feel of what you can see from that. And that actually is the Fort Evans right there. Okay? And so indeed you can monitor the Potomac and look into Virginia. Now we were only allowed, based on our application and what we could do, because Dallas was not too far downstream here, to go only up to about 800 feet. But 1,000 feet would be a little bit better view and better advantage. So another location was Clouds Mill. Now, because that is out in Virginia, well away from Washington, D.C., Lowe would have his men fill off their balloons at the Alexandria Gas Works, which is right here, tow it through town, and then go out to Clouds Mill and observe. And then down in Budds Ferry, so here's the Potomac. What was happening is the Confederates were building gun emplacements up and down the Potomac. You can see there's a shipping point right there, cockpit point, and Freestone Point really had quite an array of guns. And that was designed to blockade the Potomac. Okay? Now, if you were in Washington, D.C., you received your supplies two ways. Through railroad going through Baltimore, okay, also very southern sympathetic region, or up the Potomac. And so the Confederates started immediately blocking commerce up and down the Potomac. And they did that at these locations. And so Lowe had an opportunity to join Hooker's group. Hooker came down here to Budds Ferry. So here's the ferry. Here's the Posey House. This is the area that Lowe would be stationed. And this particular creek is where they would be using the rapidly running water to be able to use their gas generators in the field. And one of the important sketches, another one of enormous military importance, was done by William Small. the 26th Pennsylvania Infantry. He's a great artist. And he had an opportunity to go up in one of those balloons, and then you can see there's cockpit point, there's shipping point, and from that he could sketch. And you may not be able to see it, but there's numbers here. Each of these numbers that also had a legend. All right, and so when the balloons would go up, then they would say Area 5 has got more troops or less. There's fewer tents. There's all sorts of changes that are occurring. And so that kind of military intelligence was flowing into Hooker early on, and Hooker took benefit from that. What was happening is, as these balloons were making observations, is Lincoln was pushing McClellan into a major campaign of going down the Potomac and trying to knock off Richmond. All right? And so McClellan was dragging his feet for several months, but the reports coming back from the balloons were that, in particular, this area, Poet Church was the first area. This was one of Lowe's balloons. Here's where he tested the smaller ones, the Eagle, for instance. This actually is the Eagle. They began to see the withdrawal. So the withdrawal of men going down towards Richmond was given that information to McClellan. And so McClellan said, okay, let's go down to the Potomac and get this campaign started. This, of course, is the Peninsula Campaign. And one of the first things he wanted to do is send a balloon down there before he sent men. And so Lowe sent one of these aeronauts, Seaver, to get down to Fortress Monroe, which is right here. Now, this is an area where Ben Butler had issues, as I mentioned earlier. This was firmly held by the Union the whole course of the war. Here's the York River, and here's the James River, and up here is Richmond. Okay, that's what makes this the peninsula, of course. And so what he was supposed to do, Seaver was supposed to do, is get his balloon up and look for the monitor. All right. Everyone was very upset about the monitor. In fact, there was quite a bit of talk about the monitor going up the Potomac and shelling Washington, D.C., okay? So that never happened, obviously. But by having a balloon down here, giving the all okay, then McClellan was able to bring his men down and land here in Hampton, and then embark and begin to go up these roads. Now, one of the other key things that the balloons did is they were connected to the topographical engineers, and those are the guys that made maps, all right? So you have to remember, when the war started, there weren't too many Virginians, native Virginians in the Union Army anywhere, and so they were clueless as to where these roads were going, how good these roads are, and they really needed the balloon observations to help map out these roads, okay? So an enormous number, Bernard is one of the famous sketches. You can look in the Big Atlas and see many of these sketches. A lot of that information was culled out from the balloon corps and observations. They went up all the time while we're taking up. Of course, as they came up the peninsula, what happened is Magruder here in Yorktown actually built defenses across the peninsula right here and stopped the army. So as the men began to move up, Lowe ended up with Heintzelman's Corps right here, and they would launch a balloon from this location. The balloon boat, which carried a lot of the iron filings and all their other balloons and other equipment, came right up here in the Wormsley Creek, right here, so that it was easy for them to go to. And then there's a stream that dumps right into Wormsley Creek, and that's where they would fill their balloons. And then Lowe would come up to this road, right where the sawmill is, to look into Yorktown. So this was a stalemate for quite a while, a good month. They started up, and March and late in April, and it really took a whole month. First week of May, they started leaving Yorktown going back. Now, what was happening is McClellan was bringing up his big artillery and created a siege, a one-sided siege for Yorktown. Yorktown was still getting supplies, and in fact, McClellan wanted to know what was happening on the James side. So here's Lowe's balloon on the Yorktown on the York British side, and so Lowe was asked to put up a balloon at Warwick Courthouse, and he had Allen, who he just hired at that time, come in and manage the balloon here, because here's the James rating. Okay. Now at this particular location, on Keyes' staff was a young officer by the name of George Armstrong Custer, and he was asked on other occasions to go up with Allen and observe. And so it's well known. Actually, Custer wrote about this, so I'm just going to paraphrase what happened. It's amazing he actually wrote this, but on his first journey up in one of Lowe's balloons with James Allen, Custer became very fearful, and he actually cowered down at the bottom of the basket. He wouldn't come up. Okay, so this is the fearless Custer, right? He's afraid of these altitudes. Allen is standing there, of course, a decades-old aeronaut, saying, you know, come on, you're missing this fabulous view. Get out up here, you know, as they're towing the balloon, and it's only going higher. And he's getting more and more scared. And Allen asked him, well, what's your problem? And he said, well, I'm afraid the basket will break and will fall. And so Allen starts jumping up and down to demonstrate that it's not going to break. Okay? And so I'm sure that didn't help the situation. But I have to admit, Custer was able to overcome his fear. And this is one of the first examples of doing exactly that. He did get up, and then he started to enjoy the ride, and then he got it. And he went up quite often. And he would, on his own, he didn't need help, okay? And so that's one of those little interesting tidbits that helped shape his life from there on. You can see many examples where he overcame his fear and things that are pretty crazy. On May 4th, Custer was up early in the morning, like 4 or 5 in the morning, and saw Yorktown being evacuated. And he came down, sent a telegram to McClellan, who then sent a courier over to Heisselman to verify that the Confederates were leaving Yorktown, falling back on the Williamsburg Road. And indeed, Lowe went up, I think even Heisselman went with him on this one, and observed just that and confirmed that. And then that started the process of then McClellan taking Yorktown. And here's Yorktown. So this actually is a period sketch out of one of the major magazines. I will mention as an aside, Lowe loved the reporters. The reporters would come and he would feed their horses and provide them bedding so they could stay with the balloon corps and then take them up in the balloons. And he did that for marketing reasons. Okay? He wanted them to report on what they saw in the balloons, showing their value. But here was the problem with that. All right? As he would go up, particularly at night, one of the best things the balloon corps did, and they did it a lot at night in the Yorktown area, is count campfires. Okay? So you know how many Confederates you can get around a campfire? About 10. Okay? So he could count the campfires, and you could see this road is where they're at. No campfires along this road. All right? And the reporters would report that in the paper. 4 or 5 days later, General Lee would be reading that in a captured article from the New York Times. or the New York Herald, which is another one of those, or the Philadelphia Inquirer. He had all those, all they loved the Philadelphia reporters, of course. They were all down there with him, being a Pennsylvanian. And so consequently, he would have his men go over and build campfires on roads that they weren't on. Okay, so one of the best things they were doing really got important. Once McClellan took over Yorktown, they then ran up the river. They ran up the York River. They landed in what's called the Confederate White House, right here at the bed of the York River. And Law was bringing his equipment on the land. And then from there, he moves it first over to the Gainesville Farm. By that time, Richmond had quite the ring of embankments and readouts, and the men were pouring into Richmond, to keep it safe. He then set up another balloon at Mechanicsville, so that they could get some really good views. And here's actually another period sketch in a newspaper done by the reporters. And he's looking into Richmond, and he was bragging that he could see the people going to church, right? So talk about the fear that was going through the Richmond population, based on the fact that these guys were in these balloons looking down on them. What happened then is a whole series of battles, heralded by, starting with the Battle of Sparrow. We had two balloons up during that time, Gainesville balloon and Mechanicsville balloon. And also there was a telegraph operator, Parker Springs, was in the gondola with him during this particular battle. Now, what we do know is that telegraph link went down into McClellan's headquarters. So McClellan was getting real-time information about the movement of the Confederate armies and how Lee was positioning them. Now, during these fights, of course, there's so much smoke, you can't really see through that right at the front lines, but you can look around to see the flanking maneuvers and other things that were happening, and McClellan was getting that material real time. Now, a New York Times reporter reported that was also connected to the Washington, D.C. line. And so that meant Lincoln and Stanton were in the telegraph room listening to real-time balloon reports 120 miles away. Real time, So that was going on during this particular battle. Now, McClellan wanted to cross the Chickahominy, which is right here, and so you can actually wade across it during those times. And so he moved his operations to the Trent House. So of course he wanted a balloon with him at all times. Now McClellan loved to get intelligence from various sources and then synthesize it himself. That was what he liked to do. So that kind of information was incredibly important to him. And then he would make decisions on what he wanted to do. So what happens next is, here's a view as we talked about earlier, right here in this ravine where the Gainesville house is, okay? And so what was happening is once the Chickahominy, after a huge rain, overflowed its banks, cut McClellan's army in half, Lee crossed over and took Mechanicsville, and then moved down to the Gainesville area. Now, Allen, unfortunately, was able to get the balloon and all the equipment out of Mechanicsville at the time. And here is a chart from the Civil War Trust. Right here is Poet Creek, and this is the valley Lowe is in. This is his balloon station right here, and it was overrun. Okay, Wilcox's Alabamians took that, walked right by the gas generators, and several of the reports coming from these men talking about there's Lowe's gas station. They were taken back. Two of these gas generators were taken back. Lowe couldn't get them out in time. Got his balloon and gondolas out, but couldn't get the gas generators out. And they were put on display in the courtyard, the major main square in Richmond, to be put on display for everyone to walk by and see that the Blue Corps was as good as everyone thought it was. This particular area is being bought, has now been bought by the Civil War Trust and turned over to the Park Service. And several of us went down there and identified that area. And you can go on to the Civil War Trust site. This is a little overview. This is Tom Crouch, the head, at the time was the top running the Aeronautics Department at the Air and Space Museum. He's written fabulous books on Amelia Earhart and Wright brothers, by the way. And this is Mike Bowley, who was involved in the Virginia museum that's down there. This is Foley Creek. This is the creek Lowe used to these gas chambers. We've identified the location, the exact location. Here's McClellan at the train house. And of course, as things were changing, he had to make some decisions on what he was going to do. And several other battles occurred. But I want to take an aside and talk about what the Confederates were doing at the time. Because the Union Army had balloons, and a lot of them, the Confederate Army had to respond in some way. And so Lee, several months into the campaign, in June, asked Langdon Shives to develop this balloon, and he did. It was built in Savannah, Georgia. And this balloon was made up of silk that would have made dresses, okay? But these bolts of silk were sewn together, very colorful, very colorful. And this balloon was christened the Gazelle. But as soon as it started flying, although you can't see it, this is Porter Alexander. He was on Lee's staff. Porter was asked to actually fly the Gazelle. And as soon as it went up, and it was so patterned, with silk dresses on it, it was called the silk dress balloon, primarily by the Union Army. Right away, the Union Army is calling it the silk dress balloon. So that was becoming well known. The Confederates called it the Lady Davis, all right? So the Gazelle never really made it anywhere, but in one of the battles in the Peninsula, 3 balloons were up. And how that was done is the gas works in Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia. Right here, here's the railroad station. Here's the railroads. And so they would have a flat car. They'd put the Gazelle on it, they'd fill it, and then they'd run it down the peninsula. And then from that flat car, they'd go up and observe. Now, this particular balloon went 300 or 400 feet, where Lowe's balloon were up at 1,000 feet. Once those set of observations were made, Lee wanted a report from Porter Alexander. So they brought that back to Richmond, and Porter Alexander was allowed to deflate the balloon. This is not accurate. That balloon never flew from the teaser here. But the teaser carried all the balloon equipment with it and went down the James River. But what happened was it ran aground at low tide, and before high tide really picked it up so that they could leave, 2 Union vessels, the Americanza and the Monitor, came around the corner, saw it, fired on the vessel, and all the men left, and that included Porter Alexander. And so the Union Army took over the teaser. So here, this is period pictures of the teaser. Actually, the teaser was damaged. It was hit by one of the shells from the Americanza. And Lowe got the silk dress balloon. Now, the Union Army thought, oh, hey, this is great. You can use this balloon too. Lowe loved the balloon because he cut it up in little pieces and gave it out as an advertisement that his balloons were better than the Confederate balloons. In fact, he gave it to every senator and senators' wives, and that he could get his hands on it down running around in the peninsula. So Lowe, once again, as a showman, did a lot of that. Well, eventually, after many battles, McClellan was pushed back, and he moved to a particular place right here on the James, Berkeley Plantation, a place called Harrison's Landing. And this is where he stayed put for several days, more than a week actually. Lincoln was really mad at him. Lincoln said, either take Richmond or come home. So what is he going to do? He's going to come home, right? And so how is he going to do that? Well, he has a lot of wounded. He has a lot of things he wants to do. He employs the balloons. And here's James Allen in one of the balloons. This is the Washington, actually. The G.W. Clark Custis is being towed down the James River looking for the Confederates. In fact, the Confederates had several big forts, one of which was Fort Powhatan. Fort Powhatan wasn't manned at the time, and so Allen gave the all clear that you could start taking Union boats unimpeded down the James and back. And so that's what McClellan did. He moved all his men out the James that were wounded, many others, and then marched the rest of them over to Yorktown, and then they were picked up at Yorktown and then brought back. Pretty much a failed campaign from their perspective. Now, the Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville campaigns are also quite fascinating. But what was fascinating about the Fredericksburg campaign is the Union Army now is stationed in and around Fredericksburg, Virginia, after McClellan was gotten rid of and Burnside was put in charge. And here they are trying to figure out what to do. And the balloon station is right down here in this gully where the stream flows by. In fact, if you go across the river, this is the Rappahannock, on the other side of Fredericksburg, the balloon station is marked with a plaque, so you know exactly where they were. Here's the Phillips house that had already been burned down, and this is where Lowe filled these balloons. But Burnside didn't really want that intelligence, so he had one of his aides go up and look at the battle. And so in Balloon, Washington, you had Teal in a balloon looking at what was happening with charge after charge after charge on the Marie's Heights, where thousands of Union men were slaughtered in this field, and pretty much said nothing to Burnside about it. So a real failed attempt to use the balloons for any sort of important intelligence. So Burnside was then changed, and Hooker came in. Now, many of the balloonists were really mad at Lowe. They were mad at Lowe because Lowe would get money to pay them, but what he would do was use that money, this was the accusation, to buy feed and grain to feed the horses and the reporters. So the aeronauts were getting starved out, okay? And so an IG investigation came in and tried to investigate everything that was going on with Lowe and whether there was malfeasance going on. This is just as Hooker came in. And Hooker then gave his chief engineer, Cyrus Comstock, the job of running the balloon corps. And so he came in, saw that Lowe had hired his father, and he didn't like that, so he had his father fired. Clovis Lowe left. You know, that nepotism, wasn't going well with a career soldier. And then cut everybody's pay. And Lowe was so mad, Lowe refused to be paid. Now, Lowe was getting $10 a day, day after day. That's a colonel's wage, right? He negotiated that early on. So he was doing okay. And his aeronauts were getting $5 and $6 a day. And so, consequently, these two really went at it. But, of course, Comstock really is going to win out. And Lowe said, okay, at the end of the Chancellorsville campaign, and I will work for free, I am leaving the balloon corps. Okay, I'm just so disgusted working in this environment. Now, what was happening is what Hooker did was put together what was called this organization was called the BMI, okay? This is the Bureau of Military Information. And this was the organization where all intelligence flowed into. This is the start of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. This is what it goes back to. And so they were getting interviews from slaves escaping, interviews from deserters. They were getting reports from the signal operators and the telegraph operators who were out in the fields that could actually interpret flag information and bringing that back in. And then, of course, the balloon observations all were flowing into a central location, and they were analyzing it. They were weighing the certain set of intelligence that we're bringing in, emphasizing some over others based on its credibility, and then providing Hooker accurate information. And they told Hooker that Lee was set pat in this particular area and left several things unguarded. One was this ford up here, and its name escapes me at the moment. Kelly's Ford, I think, is what it is. But Hooker devised a plan then of leading a small force, pinning down some of Lee's army right here in Fredericksburg, and moving around and crossing through this ford that was not being guarded, and then surrounding Lee, okay, who was largely stationed here. And then he had stonemen wide completely around this area, so that the concept was we're going to cut off Lee's retreat from this position to Richmond, which is straight south there. The plan was probably one of the best strategic plans, military plans, that was ever done in the war, based on accurate interpretation of the intelligence. But Hooker couldn't pull it off. He brought his men over into this particular area, while keeping Early's men here with Sedgwick and held to this particular area. Lowe was in this particular balloon, and his reports were very interesting, and that was he had a telegraph operator, and he was sending telegraph messages looking for changes that Lee would either go in any direction. That was a critical intelligence. But what Hooker didn't think about is that he actually extended his force so far he couldn't get the telegraph lines all the way over. So a lot of the intelligence that were being collected by the Balloon Corps, both here at Falmouth and also at across from Fredericksburg and Banksford, which is right here, wasn't getting to Hooker. Now it turns out one of the things Lee also liked to do is he would make changes when the weather was bad because the balloons couldn't go up. Whether it was too windy or it was raining or whatever, a lot of movements were made. And during the early part of the day, he had of course, Stonewall Jackson move around and then come out from this direction. Probably not observed by the balloons definitely not observed by the balloons because they were not up. It was too windy. So Lee, whatever intelligence he gathered, was a master at being able to interpret it and then act appropriately. Well, at the end of the Chancellorsville Campaign, which was a resounding victory for the Confederate Army, and they went back to Washington in disgrace. The last activity the Balloon Corps did was in the rear. So Lowe left, and Allen was in charge of the balloons and managing it, and Cyrus Comstock was sent to Grant on the western front, and Allen then was making observations of the Confederates as they were retreating back to Washington, D.C. Now what happened was Hooker ordered that the quartermaster general pick up the equipment and take it to Washington. It didn't necessarily specify where. And the quartermaster department put it in a warehouse on New York Avenue. All right, and so it's all boxed up, all the balloons, all the gas generators, and then stored in this warehouse. Now, of course, this is my conception of what that might look like. This is from the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so it stayed there. Hooker left, Meade came in, Grant came in. Now Grant had virtually no information about the use of balloons. Meade had some because he was part of the Fredericksburg Campaign, where the balloons were absolutely ineffective because they weren't used appropriately. And so the Balloon Corps was never called out of Washington, D.C. And after a year being in the warehouse, it was decided by a clerk, with approval by a supervisor, we better sell all this stuff. And so, in April 1864, a little less than a year after they were stored in this warehouse, all the balloons, 7 balloons, all the fixtures, everything was sold on auction. Now, Lowe ends up with the balloon Washington. He comes down from Philadelphia and gets the balloon Washington. And Washington actually ends up fighting in another war in South America and doing a great job there, where they actually used the intelligence effectively. But that ends the Balloon Corps. It was an exciting time. It gathered appropriate intelligence. The problem was it was such a new technology, it was not put in the context it needed to. And when it was, in particular by Hooker, Hooker didn't last long enough to be able to make a go of it. And although the BMI was kept by Grant, and the balloons could have been used tremendously effectively at Petersburg, where everyone was in trenches. You go up, you could see everything that Lee was doing in terms of moving men to places where then it was thin and well fortified, and where you would attack. You would not have had 9 months in the trenches in Petersburg if the Balloon Corps was up and running at the time. But it was too late. They were already sold. Thank you very much. So, there's Kevin right here. Okay, so you're in the Balloon Corps. Kevin portrays Thaddeus Lowe, and I portray James Allen, the real aeronaut of the group. Can I take some questions? Yes, sir.
Did the Confederates ever make any serious effort to shoot them down?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So in the war, there was at least 3,000 flights, okay? And they were shot at constantly. They were probably the most shot at people. There's plenty of stories of actual cannonballs going between the basket and the balloon. Okay? And they were full of holes. Okay? And so Lowe, when he would get a detail of men, would want sailmakers. Okay, this is why I like some of the Maine and the Massachusetts group, because typically you would pull out 30 men, and some of them were involved in shipping, and they were sailmakers, because when the balloons came down, they needed to be repaired. And so the Corps would do that. There's only one accident, and that accident happened at Chancellorsville. Hooker really wanted the balloons up. Something was going on. He absolutely demanded that the Balloon Corps go up and make an observation. This is after Chancellorsville. He was trying to decide what he was going to do next, and of course, Lincoln was just getting mad about it and would eventually get rid of him. So he ordered the Allen brothers, James and Ezra Allen were part of the Balloon Corps, to go on up. Ezra Allen takes the Washington up, but after they pulled out a 1,000-foot line, they were only up about 300 feet. The wind was enormous, okay? And Allen told him that. The Allen brothers told him this is just not the weather we should be in. It split a seam, the whole seam, and the whole gas bag evacuated and was rocketing down 300 feet. Now, who was on the lines was the 4th Maine. And they'd been with Lowe for many, many months, and they ran upwind. And so instead of the gondola going straight down, it actually came down at an angle and hit, and Ezra Allen survived that. But that was the only accident out of all the flights they did. Yes?
Well, talk to me how many balloons were put into service
like Union, how many Confederates balloons were?
So Low had 7, Hill Mountain had 2, okay? Wise had 1, but it never worked well. Allen had 2 with him. They had problems, okay? The Confederates had a higher balloon, okay, that they actually used in and around Yorktown with no success at all. The silk dress balloon was used quite effectively by Porter Alexander, and there was at least 2 the Confederates had down in Savannah. There's plenty of reports that indicated the Confederates would go up to look around and see what was happening, and they used 2 balloons down in Savannah. Lee had another balloon made and kept it in storage so we could call it out if he needed to. And once the balloon corps was taken apart, he decided never to call it out, because if he did, then he was afraid the Union Army would also do it, and they had far more resources. But he had 1 in storage. That was called the Nimbus, built by Cheaters. Yes. All right, I'll come back to you. Yes, young man. All right, okay. If anyone can remember one, yes.
Let's see, I can't, no. 2 quick questions. Number 1, were balloons used, let's say, in an earlier war, like the Crimea, or was the Civil War first? And second, the intelligence is only as good as the quality of the observers, riding the balloon. Was there any kind of special training or, to help these people, these
Right,
people give accurate information?
Sure, that's a great question. So, yes, the Crimean had it, okay, and yes, the Mexican War, they were actually moving ahead with a balloon. Wise was the head of that.
Oh, wow.
Who was also an aeronaut, Pennsylvania from Lancaster, actually, who ended up going into one of the cavalry units. Relative to how good were the aeronauts would go up with trained officers all the time. And Lowe was up in the balloon early on with Fitzjohn Porter. And Fitz talked to him for hours, like 8 hours at a stretch. What are they going to talk about? Lowe's going to talk about how you manage the balloon. Porter's going to talk about what we're trying to look for. The aeronauts were actually well trained, okay? However, because they were not military, but civilians, their stories, quote unquote, were not always believed, okay? So there was always a discount. Well, it came from an aeronaut. Who's an aeronaut? They don't know anything about military. No, that's a completely bogus argument.
Yeah.
They know an enormous amount about it. Now, how do I know this is the case? Because Fitzjohn Porter ends up in a balloon that escaped, and he was looking at Yorktown in a free flight. And he knew enough about the balloons not to be worried. He actually sketched Yorktown, got the sketches he wanted, which were McClellan wanted to know what guns were pointed onto the York River, because he wanted Goldborough to blow by that if the guns weren't in place. And so Fitzjohn Porter made those observations, okay? And as it was at altitude, then lowered it, caught a wind back, and then climbed out of the balloon and pulled the ripcord and deflated the balloon and landed it. He's a military guy. This was exactly what an aeronaut would do. So the opportunity for these aeronauts to learn the trade was there, and they clearly did. Their problem is they weren't tasked enough. All right? What do I mean by that? You've been in a balloon, because we just talked about it. The whole area is there. What are you looking for? All right? So from a military perspective, it might be activity on a particular area, a particular road. That's where you want to concentrate your attention on. But you need to be tasked. If you go up and you come back down and they say, well, what did you see? Oh my God, so this and that, this and that, this and that, this and that. Well, what moved? Well, it didn't have opportunity. I would look over here. They had to task it. Okay? That's exactly what the military does now. with their space assets, they're tasked. The time is we need to observe these areas. Observe it. Okay? So the technology was great. It came at a wonderful time, but the military infrastructure did not know how to use it. Only a few of these guys in the military really did, but they got swept out early on. Yes, sir.
Optics, did they use a standard optics when they were up?
Yeah, so Lowe had these fabulous glasses, fabulous, binocular glasses. And when the aeronauts set up a place, one of the first things they asked for is bring up the binoculars. And there's several reports where they did that.
Any power? Did they mention?
I don't remember what that was. Yes, ma'am.
Were the balloons always tethered?
Yeah.
Everything I saw had lines
Yeah.
going up, so.
Not
I
always.
would imagine the
Yeah,
control
not
would be
always, but 99% of the time. Lamont loved free flies. He loved to go out, fly all over the place, come back, report a few things, and then spend 3 or 4 or 5 days getting his balloon filled and goofing around. Whereas Lowe knew that they needed constant observations, and they needed to be portable. You needed to go to a place to make an observation, which is why the flat top carrier gave great flexibility. The concept of having men on the line, moving to where you needed to go. You could go right up to the front, see what you needed to, and then fall back. So you have enormous flexibility. So the tethered balloons was the way to go. But Lamont didn't do it because his balloons, he would do a tether occasionally, but his balloons were not built to be tethered. And that's part of the problem. Lowe built them to be tethered. Yes, young man, you got your question.
Yes. Was Abraham Lincoln ever on board with the idea of balloons? And if not, did he ever try to stop the idea?
No, Lincoln went out of his way to create the balloon force. Okay? So he introduced Lowe to Scott, who was the commanding general before McClellan, and insisted that he do something. Okay? He wasn't directing General Scott to create a balloon corps, but that's what he wanted. He loved the concept of that defense in and around Washington, and he was really okay with the idea of Lowe taking up newspapermen, because then all the reports that were coming out in the Washington Star and all the other Washington newspapers about gloom and doom and the Confederates were just ready to come over were dismissed because the reporters were writing what they saw in the line.
One more question, guys, Carol.
Okay, you pick it.
Right,
Is
go.
there any information that you have how those are used in frontal question war?
No, I knew they are, and they actually leveraged the concept of the gas generators that Lowe did. There are several. Yeah, so many improvements occurred in the balloon corps based on of other nations based on what we did in the Navy.
Okay,
I was just wondering if there's any books you would recommend.
Okay, so there's a book that was published a couple years ago by Evans called The War of the Aeronauts. Don't buy that. I can't read a page of it without finding the problem. The best book, but it only covers part of the balloon corps, is by Hayden, and it's called The Aeronautics of the Union and Confederate Armies. And it's came out in the 40s, but reissued by, I think, John Hopkins Press. And Tom Crouch wrote a really beautiful intro to the book. But it's really an outstanding book. And then mine will come out in about 2 years.
all right.
Thank you very much.
No, if you were speaking
Perfect.
one more.
I love it.
I don't know if you heard or not.
I do. I love it.
So,
Yes.
so on the way home,
Yeah.
you want a nice sweet treat to the.
All right.